So I want to welcome you all to tonight's Better Building Speaker Series. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to do a land acknowledgement, then we'll do some introductions, and I'll just review tonight's agenda, and we'll give Peggy the floor. The Better Building Speaker Series is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq. We're grateful to live in this place that has been home to Linu since time immemorial, and we honor past, present, and future traditional knowledge keepers. We honor and support Indigenous sovereignty and the peace and friendship treaties that bind us all in relationship. As an environmental organization working in these lands and waters, EAC is committed to upholding our responsibilities as treaty people and to working toward decolonization and environmental justice. Tonight, we're joined by Peggy Cameron, an environmental consultant with a master's in environmental studies, owner and vice president of a Nova Scotia renewable energy company, and co-founder of the community group Friends of the Halifax Common. Peggy will be talking to us today for about half an hour about embodied carbon as it relates to building, demolition, and the construction industry. After Peggy's talk, we'll have time for some questions, and then I will give you a sneak preview as to next month's speaker. Embodied carbon is the carbon footprint of a building, referring to the carbon dioxide produced in maintaining the building and eventually demolishing it, transporting the waste, and recycling it. Why choose to use existing structures over new builds?
Great, thanks very much. And thanks for everybody for giving up time on a beautiful sunny afternoon. And just thinking of the land acknowledgement that Hannah just did, I was reminded again of the loss of one of our elders in our community this past week, who was truly a symbol for peace and friendship, Bill Lewis. And I think we all need to be more patient and understanding and take a lesson from him on that. My work on looking into what I prefer to call upfront carbon as opposed to embodied carbon started around 2018, 2019, coming out of a lot of the work that was happening on the center plan, and sort of seeing the carelessness of the changes that I felt were happening in the city. And so in fall or in early, I guess it was pre-COVID, I had put in a proposal to a company in Toronto. It's a Canadian-based climate consultancy called Mantle, and they were looking at helping me establish what would be the upfront carbon, or the, as I say, the carbon cost for a particular case study in Halifax. Okay, next slide, please. So as Hannah mentioned, upfront carbon is the carbon associated with the production and manufacturing of materials used in building, but it's also in anything. If we think about heat pumps, there's an upfront carbon cost to heat pumps, for example. And in 2019, there was not any real acknowledgement of that in North America. There was beginning to be more in Europe and particularly in the UK, but overall it's estimated that it's about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and compared to building operations, which is about 28%. So that would be heating, lighting, and cooling. These are other ones that we may be more familiar with. Transportation is probably more in Canada because of the size of the vehicles that we drive, very fuel inefficient. Other is 6%. And then there's things we don't talk about. For example, military is something like 5.5%, and that would not be wars. That's just military. Next slide. And again, this shows how embodied carbon is really in the production, the resource extraction, transportation, installation of building materials. There's a small portion that would be happening in the maintenance of buildings, and really that's where it's coming in. Okay, next slide, please. So the case study that I chose to look at was the Carlton block. Some of you in Halifax may recognize this series of buildings at the corner of Roby Street and on Roby Street here rather, and Spring Garden Road here. Next slide. And the interest in this area really came out because during the center plan consultation, there was a public consultation, and the city was looking at where they would have targeted growth areas. They were proposing in this entire neighborhood, there could be something like 2 10-story buildings, or would the public want 1 10-story building and 2 5-story buildings? And then it got really confusing because a developer came forward and they were proposing 16 and 22 stories, but then it seemed to change to 24 and 26 stories. And in fact, it was 2 developers. So with the help of a very capable architect, Hadrian Lang, we decided, well, it was proper for the city to propose what these would look like together, but the city absolutely did never do that. And so we showed the public what they would look like if they were the 4 towers on less than 1 city block. And we showed what it would look like relative to the size of the Nova Center, which you can see outlined here. And eventually, the city gave more and more away to the developers, and for nothing in return, there will now be 4 towers greater than 30 stories, or approximately 30 stories on this block. Next slide, please. We proposed a model that would be able to be infilled within the block. That would be, it could be 7 to 9 stories. It would be something like 550 to 650 units, depending on if you were including commercial space in the bottom. And unlike the 4 towers, which will demolish 12 to 14 buildings, this infill in the backyard, which has essentially been turned into a parking lot for about 150 spaces, the infill would have only required the demolition of 1 building here on Roby Street. And as we were doing that, there were other developers doing something similar. This is a building on Queen Street, which some of you may know about. It's directly opposite it's near where the public library is. And a developer purchased a single family home and converted it or duplicated it in its backyard and created, I think it's 11-story building. Or sorry, 11-unit building. And then you can see this is a model of other ways that you can do small scale infill in Barcelona, for example, which is very well known for the amount of density, the fact that it has interior core spaces where there's lots of light and air and private space. Next slide, please. So in the time frame where I was looking at what would be the embodied carbon or the upfront carbon for the construction of these 4 towers, I was in contact with Keith Soltaire, and there was more information becoming available, just more generic. And it was clear that for lower rise buildings, say 1 to 6 stories or 7 to 14 stories, that the amount of carbon dioxide per square measure was substantially less than by the time you were getting over 15 stories to 25. And that's just a general finding that you could find from a Google search. Next slide, please. And in the end, our consultant found that the 4 towers would emit about 31,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, compared to the Citizens infill, which was 18,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And it was substantially different per square meter. So the high rises would produce 360 to 490 tons of kilograms rather of CO2 equivalents. And the Citizens infill, which was the 7 to 9 story, with careful planning could be 0 carbon, but just on regular spec would be about 270 to 380. It was 40% less per square meter. And then we also calculated what would be the cost to unnecessarily have to replace the floor area of the 12 to 14 buildings that were going to be demolished. Those buildings were equivalent to a single 12-story apartment building or 3 4-story apartment buildings. And that was about 2,214 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. We also were looking at the same time, because we wanted to show that there was a better option, we were trying to show that the city didn't have to be approving these very carbon intensive buildings, also very expensive buildings. And generally they take a lot longer to plan for. It requires demolishing numerous properties or acquiring properties. And because the materials are more carbon intensive, like aluminum, steel, glass, and cement, they are necessarily more expensive. So it's like a greater cost and therefore less likely to be affordable. There was a report from previously known as Ryerson, but now it's the Metropolitan University in Toronto, and they were showing all the ways that a distributed density is able to infill an existing empty space and achieve the same number of units in, I guess a more accommodating way without the requirement for demolition. Next slide, please. And because I was curious about the rate of demolitions, I started to look at the open source data that HRM collected for building permits. It was a very messy site. They don't really have the number of units. They didn't have the kind of structure. But in general, once I checked the data several times, I concluded that over the course of, say, the past 20 years, the number of demolitions was increasing. It averages about 141 per year. And you could see that really it started to increase around 2008 after the market crash in the United States. And then again, as we approached the final phases of the center plan, maybe when developers were looking at starting to speculate or understanding that the outcome of the center plan might curtail their ability to be able to acquire and demolish land. Okay, next slide, please. The area, if we were to look at that 2,600 total number of buildings that were demolished between 2003 and 2020, it's actually 2,535 buildings. The area, if we assumed a modest size of 1,500 square feet, would be equivalent to 17 city blocks. And by that, I don't mean a house beside each other. I mean, that's actually the floor area that's been taken out of primarily housing stock in Halifax. And any building that's there now is certainly more affordable than something that's going to replace it. Okay, next slide, please. So there seems to be all of these numbers getting thrown around. They don't really mean very much. So I tried to find out what an equivalency would be. The 31,000 tons for the 4 towers is equivalent to 9,497 passenger vehicles. And I guess that puts paid to some of the assertions by some members of council, or even the general idea that people feel that density will reduce the, say, reliance on transportation to the extent that any upfront carbon, that's carbon associated with the materials that goes immediately into the atmosphere once we've produced those materials, that it takes many years of either efficiency in reduced transportation or efficiency in operations. For operations, it can take 80 to 120 years to recapture in energy savings the emissions that would be put out immediately. And as well, so towards the end of the period of time where I was writing my report, there was a study in the United Kingdom which looked at operational energy. And it showed that many times what we're looking with in energy efficiency around heating, lighting, and cooling is based on modeling. But this was one that actually looked at what was the true amount of energy being used. And their conclusion was between 5 stories and 21 stories, so rising from those heights to beyond that, meant that there was 36% increase in fossil fuel use, and by 42% with mean carbon emissions more than doubling. So effectively, and it's not that well understood, but it could be simply because tall buildings are higher in the elements, they're exposed to more sun or more wind, they are definitely less efficient than buildings that are lower rise. Next slide, please. There's many different kinds of proposals that you can find on the internet. And if you do research, there's a guy in Vancouver who does a lot of proposals for small scale infill passive buildings. Here's one example. Next slide. Here are a few more, just kind of like modular. You can scale them up or scale them down. This is a slide I saw on Twitter a couple of days ago by a guy called Hayden Clarkson. He took quite a lot of grief because he was proposing, well, let's look at how we could densify suburbs. And it's very polarizing because people feel you have to densify urban cores. But my question is, well, are the suburbs really going to go away? So how would we look at rationally densifying them? In many suburbs, because people will be less likely to maybe transport to and from work, they'll be working from home. Many suburbs may be small, walkable, 15-minute cities or communities. This is a recent proposal for Strawberry Hill, and you can see it's a number of towers together. And we have no idea what the upfront carbon cost of that would be. It's also going to be putting very high demands on existing infrastructure for water and sewage. And yet we would approve that because we feel at this time, this is the way we need to achieve density. Next slide, please. And yet we know also from other studies, not from my study, but if you look at the 4, say, general urban forms, low rise, low density, low rise, most North American cities, or low density, high rise, maybe New York, Manhattan. Or if you look at high density, low rise, perhaps Paris, or high density, high rise, perhaps Hong Kong. Of these 4, an analysis for life cycle greenhouse gas emissions over a 60-year period and population density showed that the best form was something between 4 and 6 stories. And this looked at including upfront carbon and then the operational carbon over a 60-year period. Next slide, please. So if you're living in Halifax, many of you would be aware that there's been a lot of demolition. This was 8 buildings, and many of them were multi-unit. On this lot, there was a lot of speculation by a demolisher named Temicles, and it was because the lots had very deep, they went back quite far to the backyards of the homes on Edward Street, 200 feet. And in fact, all of these buildings had the same potential as the Queen Street building to be doubled inside, to be repurposed and or retrofitted and really increase the density, at least double, potentially more. Next slide, please. And we've had a number of buildings which are larger scale. This was 3 stories with 46 units at the corner of, I guess, North and Oxford. This is the Dennis building, and this was a 5-unit building on Yonge Avenue. Next slide, please. These were all affordable housing, and every one of them could have been doubled in size. And not that's when I would say this was 8 buildings on one block, but again, the backyards could have been expanded. And this is something that I think we're not really fully appreciated in Halifax with our old buildings, is the materials are very, very solid. They're very well built. And the buildings have had and could continue to have a lot of flexibility. Many of these might be over 100 years old, but they could have a lot of life in them, and certainly much more than many of the new buildings, which we're not sure even of what the quality of engineering is, or what they will be able to withstand when we think about all of the extreme weather our city will be subject to from climate change. I should check with you, Hannah. I don't know how much time's left, so I could wrap it up sooner rather than later, because I want to leave time for people to have questions.
Sure. It's about 5 to 6.
Okay, so I think just if you could pop through the next couple of slides.
Sure. And take your time. I don't have a lot to say as a wrap up, so this is really very interesting. So yeah, please take your time.
Okay. Yeah, so in 2020, there was another working with another couple of people, we started to track demolition permits. And it was like the peninsula had measles. I mean, these are all buildings that were gone, and we tracked them, and we did draw attention to it. But the city is, I guess they have the attitude, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break an egg. And what we're saying is that we really should be focused on the flexibility of these buildings, expanding them, and then also looking at infilling underutilized space. Halifax has a tremendous amount of land available on the peninsula that has never been included in the center plan. And it's only now that some of these properties are coming up for development. Next slide, please. This is an example of an apartment building that I can't remember if it was 11 stories or 18 stories. I think it had 78 all affordable units, and it was demolished. And the permission, when the application came before City Council for approval for redevelopment, it also included these low-rise apartments at the base of the building. And the company that owns it is a Hong Kong-based company, and they actually said this was before interest rates went up, that one of the motivations was low interest rates, and that this was an opportunity for them to redevelop and really improve their asset by making more money. Next slide, please. So there's a number of other opportunities which Halifax hasn't been talking about in our affordability crisis. There's an excellent author and researcher from Ontario called Brian Doucette, and one of the things that he's talking about is all publicly land should be used for affordable housing. And this is certainly something myself and a number of people have been asking the city for several years now, when we sold off lands like St. Pat's High School or St. Pat's Alexandra. Certainly the community at Bloomfield worked for 18 to 20 years to have that public land used for public benefit. And we also know that the Cogswell interchange, and that's something I didn't mention, but when that area was demolished, about 2,600 buildings were taken out of the downtown, and that land or acreage is really an opportunity for the city to be giving back to the community and using that publicly owned land to provide social housing, family housing, and affordable housing. And it's the same thing as well with Shannon Park, which is owned by the federal government. Next slide, please. I don't know whether many of you have taken the time to look at the back of the $10 bill, but Viola Desmond, her community is shown on, and you can see that this small scale grid actually shows all of the housing where these 2,600 buildings were. This is buildings that are still existing quite near, I guess it would be, what street would that be? It's on Water Street, close to...
This looks like Morris Street.
No, it's not Moores Street, but in any case, I just wanted to show it to you that it's in the same area as the downtown, and these buildings are quite fancy, and these buildings are similar to what the city did demolish because they said in the 1960s these were part of the slum clearances. So capital and corporate interests are always looking for new places and new ways to land their money. And these buildings, again, have the same kind of flexibility that all of Viola Desmond's community in the Cogswell area would have had. They can be multi-unit, they can be added on to, even mansard roofs can be expanded. And there's many, many ways that if we were more thoughtful, or if we gave funds to small scale developers instead of handing everything over to larger scale developers, our city could retain a lot of its character and certainly reduce the impact that we're having on climate. Next slide, please. So just a little comment, I guess I should wrap up now to talk about the Federal Accelerator Fund. It's $80 million coming to Halifax over 4 years, and it's to cut down on barriers to building housing. When our mayor first heard about it, he said, well, we have like X number of units already approved, and we have X number of units already as of right. And really what the constraints are is interest rates, lack of labor, supply chain issues. And then what we don't talk about is developer portfolio or pleasure. And that means developers, big developers, have long time frames about when they will do development. And it's based on what are they doing presently, what's the interest rate, and what are they intending on doing next. The Carlton block, which I looked at, the second of the 2 developments were approved in January, and it was noted at the public hearing that the development had been undertaken and come to the city about 9 years ago. So over that 9 years, everyone who's living in that neighborhood, the 110 to 112 small scale affordable units, are kind of living knowing that they will be having to move, and the developers really not motivated to build that building until such time as they've maximized what they can get, and that was in height, and also when it would make sense for them to build it. Currently, Halifax has about 15,179 units available under permit, and then they have development ready land for over 250,000 units as of right. And unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of polarization in our community. People who question what's going on with our zoning are automatically framed as NIMBYs, even though in my case, for example, I did very careful work with an engineering firm to show that we have better opportunities working with what we have. In other cases, people might be looking for affordable housing and believing that the Accelerator Fund will augment that. But in fact, none of this $80 million will be going to affordable housing. A lot of it's just going to hiring planners to undo planning that we spent about a decade agreeing on under the Center Plan. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that. Oh, and there was one slide at the bottom, if you could just go down to it, it showed, yeah, this one. This is very interesting because this shows all of the area on the peninsula and the density, and you can see, well, this is the Halifax Common, that's not going to count, but you can see the number of areas, say in the north end, where there's lots of dealerships, lots of underutilized industrial lands, and how what we really have done so far with our corridors is we've increased density in areas where developers acquired or had parcels of land. And once you increase zoning, it seems that it's automatically increasing land speculation and land values inflate. And to give you a real-time example, Temecles was the developer, or you could say demolisher, who demolished about 32 properties on the Halifax Peninsula. A lot of it was along Robie Street, Coburg, and elsewhere. And there was an article last, say August or September, that in All Nova Scotia, which talked about Temecles having sold his empty parcels of land for $62 million. He didn't sell all 32 of them, but he sold, I don't know, say he sold 25, and he sold them for $62 million. So we know that he certainly wouldn't have paid that amount for those homes. And we know that the next developer who does build the properties will have to absorb that inflated value into his land even before he begins to put buildings on that. So inflating land value by increasing zoning is not a solution for affordability. Okay, I'm going to stop now.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm just going to start with a couple of clarifying questions, if that's okay, and then we'll just open up the floor. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. If you're not comfortable speaking, feel free to turn your cameras on if you would like, or leave them off. And I think we might have like an option just to raise your hand, or you can just wave your hand around if your camera's on. But I had a question for you, Peggy. You talked about infilling a couple of times, and we also talk about things like infilling in Dartmouth Cove. So to me, that means pouring a whole bunch of junk into a space. So could you clarify by what you mean by that?
That's a very good question. And also, I would like to just let people know, I mean, if just for perspective on the amount of money that the federal government is offering, the $80 million, $20 million per year, I feel like a lot of people aren't good on numbers. So our public library cost us about $50 million, and that was 10 years ago. And then last August, again, I was reading, and it was not well published in the media, but the federal government gave Irving's $463 million to infill 13 acres of Halifax Harbor for the shipyard, and that there was never any discussion about that. So that's one kind of infilling. The kind of infilling I'm talking about is say infilling in the case of the Carlton block. All the backyards for years had been converted into parking lots. So infilling in that case was using that empty, underutilized land to build the 7 to 9 story building. On all along Roby Street and on Kempt Road, there's, acres of underutilized surface parking lot. I mean, much of it's car dealerships. You could infill that. That would be places where you could do different kinds of development at different scales and really be augmenting the city's, the population of the urban core. So that's what I mean by infilling.
Great, thank you so much for clarifying that. I just want to say a weird thing was happening as a few people logged on. They all popped up with my name. So I'm going to say, Hannah Minsloff, you have your hand up. Your name might not be Hannah, but I don't know what it is. So I will unmute you, and feel free to ask your question. Don't seem to be able to unmute you. Let's see. I'm going to call you guest 2, and then you'll know who you are. Are you able to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Just while you're getting that straightened out, I'd also say that some of the counselors they seem like they're a little bit no wonder she's
sorry. Glory because she hasn't had a meal for 2 months.
Yeah.
Her last meal was in February.
So there was someone who had their hand up. Yeah. That was you. Yeah, please go ahead. with your-
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me now, can you?
Yes.
Oh, okay,
Okay,
okay.
great. I hear some other noise going on, but it's not at this end, I don't think. I really liked your presentation again, Peggy. I've heard you present before. This is very clear. The thing I just like to note is this. $80 million from the federal government is not much money. I have to tell you, just in terms of money, it's not a lot of money. And what we're seeing is this is an entire cash giveaway to developers entirely. That's what's going to happen. This $80 million, for instance, what's going to be plowed into Cogswell or plowed into any of these new developments, when the developers come forward and their hats are out for money, this is what's going to be given to them. And it's extremely shameful. Public money is going to private developers and is making them incredibly rich. At the same time, the private developers have extremely deep pockets. And Peggy made note of that. She said, these guys have had 10 years to do something on the question of the Carlton block, and they've done virtually nothing that I've seen. I live near there. They've done virtually nothing that anyone's seen. They haven't done a thing for a decade. So they have deep pockets. They can wait a long time before they develop. They can wait until maybe your borrowing costs go down. Maybe there's more carpenters around. Maybe there's more architects around. I don't know, whatever they're looking for. But it's extremely worrisome to me that this housing amount, this huge amount of 80 million, which isn't really a lot of money in today's terms, that's all going to go to private developers. I mean, there might be a little bit earmarked for some cooperatives in outside of town or some rebuilding of some, provincial government spaces, but most of it goes private.
Yeah, I just would comment on that it's actually a kind of a housing hijack is happening all across Canada. And it used to be, I think, something like 45% of people living in Halifax were renters. And in the past decade or so, it's about 65%. Most of the affordable housing where the majority of the speculation is taking place is on the peninsula. So people who have lower wages are really being expelled. It's kind of like I don't think it is. I think there's another meaning for neocolonialism, but it is a recolonization and a corporatization of housing to the extent where many more people will just be paying the lords of the manor for their personal gain. And it's very concerning that, it's such a short time frame that the council wouldn't approve Patty Cuddle's motion to say, well, let's give it one more week so we could have public input. We could hear more from the public about what they think about this. And that's in contrast to us having taken, I think, over a decade to put together the center plan, which, as our mayor described, has got all of these units that could be being built and won't be because of other reasons.
Thank you for those comments. Does anyone else have any questions or comments or thoughts to share? Well, I'll just say thank you for sharing where you're from. Peggy, if you haven't seen, we have guests from PEI, Sydney, Cape Breton, and places in between. So it's a really nice breadth of guests with us this evening.
Mm-hmm. I did want to say that it seems like there's a lot of misunderstanding on the part of council about what the options are too. A couple of the councillors who voted in support of the Lowen or Dexel development at the Carlton block felt like it was better to put density there than to put it in Bedford or to put it in, someplace in more of a suburban area. The whole point of my work was to show that we could have density that could be distributed or use on underutilized land, and we could have density that would have much less impact on the climate. We have to keep reminding ourselves that we're supposed to be halving our emissions by 2030. And yet what we're continuing to do is to put massive amounts of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And further research showed me that we could be really having carbon negative or carbon positive development, whereby if we were very careful in our materials choice, like if we were having carbon neutral, or in some forms of materials, you can have materials which draw down carbon. And then if we were doing energy efficient buildings, and if we were including solar or different ways of ensuring that there was some kind of efficiency in the heating or operational components of the buildings, we would have buildings which would be not costing our carbon futures in any way. And yet we're in our big rush suddenly, because of the affordability crisis, which has been a long time in the making, we are suddenly being pushed to accept any kind of building anywhere, anytime. And it's a big error, because even the types of buildings that we're building are not energy efficient. We're building walls of glass. We're building buildings that have not necessarily the time span that we need to have them for our future. So it's a lot of short-term political decisions.
We have a comment saying right now there are about 20 empty buildings, all owned by one of 3 levels of government in HRM, I'm assuming, but our governments refuse to renovate the buildings for housing. There's a building close to where I live that has been a government building, and it's empty at the moment. I don't know what the plans are for it, but it would be an ideal location in Dartmouth for housing, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I mean, we've also lost a lot of buildings that were owned by government. It's only recently that the federal government has decided to look at repurposing buildings ahead of selling them. So we had the Ralston building downtown. It was sold to a developer. And at the time it was sold, I spoke with someone who was working with the Canadian federal government, and it would have cost $150,000 to shore up the basement. And that was the reason they decided it should be demolished. But $150,000 is absolutely nothing in the scale of what it would cost to replace that building. And also, governments tend to spend a lot of money. That building had been renovated and maintained. Another example is the Halifax Memorial Library sitting there empty, just waiting to fall apart, because then they'll have to tear it down. They did the same thing with St. Pat's and Bloomfield. These are all missed opportunities. Kind of criminal.
Yeah. Peggy, when you're talking about embodied carbon of existing buildings, we also talk about that in terms of new buildings and construction. Can you talk a little bit about the difference, if there is one, and then what that means even on a much smaller scale? So if someone's doing some renovations on their home or some energy efficiency work on their home, what does that mean? What are kinds of things that we can look out for? What can we advocate for to council and other levels of government in terms of language and talking about the differences with those types of buildings?
That's a really great question, because unfortunately we're like in the UK and European countries, the European Union, there's more of a uniform approach to identifying what they call it the global warming potential of a product is. And unfortunately, I think in Canada, we're sort of starting to do that, but there's generally in the trades very little awareness of that. And one example would be heat pumps. The refrigerants that were used in heat pumps until maybe 2 years ago were very, very high global warming potential. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Project Drawdown, but that was an organization of many scientists and researchers who came together and looked at what would be the top 50 things we could do if we were going to reduce emissions. And the top one at the time, I'm not sure what it would be now, but say 3 or 4 years ago when it came out, would be to stop the leak of refrigerants from HVAC systems, so systems that were used for heating and cooling. But it's only maybe since 2 years that we've had a less carbon intensive refrigerant. So that's just one example. When we're doing all of our caulking, we need to be thinking, what is this product, what's the global warming, and really in Canada we don't have very good standards for how we can inform ourselves, and certainly our tradespeople and even architects. We put a lot of focus on energy efficiency. We might build a passive house, but the passive house might take 80 to 120 years to recapture the materials, or the energy that was used to produce the materials, because we're thinking of efficiency and energy from an operational perspective. That's like heating, lighting, and cooling. We're not thinking of what is the upfront carbon cost. Just on your question about what is embodied carbon when we think of an existing building, if we have a building that's already built, we think of it that the carbon's already in there and it's kind of in place. So the way I started to think about it, and it was kind of a big revelation or turning point in my brain, because there was so much information I was observing and I had no expertise in this at all. But what I realized was, when we demolish a building, say in the case of the Carlton block, we're going to demolish 10 to 12 to 14 buildings. One already collapsed because it fell when they tried to move it. When we replace that floor area, that 12-story or 3-4-story apartment building space, that's a penalty. That's replacing floor area that is requiring materials and products that are adding greenhouse gas emissions unnecessarily. And yet we don't even have that in our brains and think about it in a carbon budget. In our council, when I brought up the idea of a carbon budget, many councillors pushed back and said they have no authority for how they could have jurisdiction over a carbon budget. That would be how much carbon we can spend to build a building. But in fact, by increasing heights, they're ensuring that there is no accounting for a carbon budget, because they're incentivizing demolitions. And then, as my findings and many other researchers are finding, the taller you make a building, the more intensive the materials are that are required, and therefore disproportionately greater amount of carbon emissions for the upfront carbon. So that's a long-winded answer, but it's very layered, just like the solution to our housing crisis is very layered. And so we shouldn't be supposing that developers offering high rises is the single solution.
Thank you. We have another question. Wayne, if you'd like to unmute. You're on mute, Wayne.
Okay, I'm on now. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Well, I guess what I was wondering is too, there's lots of places. I realize that Halifax Regional Municipality is the economic engine of the province. I fully understand that. But there's all kinds of places outside Halifax Regional Municipality. Hants County is growing well. Kings County is doing exceptionally well. Sometimes we have to step outside the box and maybe look at them places as a thought. I don't know what your guest is thinking about that, but that'll give them something to chew on anyways.
Thank you, Wayne.
I think you raise a very good point. I think it's become problematic that we have 20,000 people move to the city, and all of a sudden we think we have to accommodate them. And the urgency is critical, but part of it is how we've constructed that, or it's social factors. Like, one was a lot of people moved here during COVID. then Nova Scotia had kind of a sped up program for incentivizing people to come here to get permanent residency. We need labor here. We want new talent, and yet we're not doing very much to accommodate them. And in all of that, we forget we're a very small population. We just turned 1 million last year, and that's a tiny number of people. Over 500,000 people live in HRM. So it is problematic that everybody is kind of being expected or driven to our major urban core, when there's other areas in the province where people could be very happily accommodated and drawn into the same kind of work opportunities that we need. We need everywhere. New tradespeople, there's so many. We're also an aging population, so there's a huge turnover in all of our professions, and throughout the province, we need new blood and new ideas.
I guess, yeah, just one more little thing here. It's a minor thing, but Hants County is not that far away from Halifax. Kings County is not that far away from Halifax. And I would bet $2 with anybody that's listening, land is a lot cheaper out there than it is in the city. And it's, as far as living in the city and working in the city, I don't know if I'd want bragging rights about it. If you get in your car and try to go somewhere in the morning about 7 o'clock or 7:30, it's not that easy. So yes, it's a commute problem, but you have a different lifestyle too, further out from the city. Like I said, not everybody wants to live in the city, and there's not accommodations for everybody in the city. So maybe we should look outside that Halifax regional municipality economic engine with 500,000 people. The other 500,000 or 700,000 over that live outside the city. So I know you can't stretch to Yarmouth, I understand that, but there's quite a lot of people live in Kings, and there's quite a lot of people live in Hants County. So I think we can think outside of Halifax. It doesn't have to always be Halifax, and not because I'm from the Valley either.
Yeah, I would caution you, because I think one of the problems and one of the opportunities with densification by having increased population in urban cores or even in towns is that we're trying to avoid people undertaking a lifestyle where they rely on commuting to work. And so it is problematic that people live in Truro and commute to Halifax, or live in the Valley and commute to Halifax. And in fact, it means that Halifax to many people is just a place to go and take from their work, and they're not affected by what the outcome of their lifestyle is on people living in the city. So I do support the idea of densification. I do see the challenges of why are we not looking at other places in throughout the province, because there are many opportunities with existing housing, available land, and so on.
I agree.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a really fascinating conversation this evening. Thank you, Peggy, for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you for the great questions from our attendees. I'll just give you a small plug for next month's event. So on May 29th, same time, same place at 5:30 p.m. Atlantic, we will be joined by Rupinder Kaur from the Verschuren Center in Cape Breton. We'll be talking about Net Zero Atlantic's GeoCat project. I encourage you to come back and join us then. And again, thanks so much. Hope you have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you soon.